Hey everybody, Bobby Medina here with my very good friend and buddy Paul Barron. And we are here to help trumpeters learn to play efficiently, combat the effects of aging, and improve even if you don't have a ton of time to practice. And we have a very special guest artist with us today. He's actually an exoclinician artist for Jupiter Company. He has spent 15 years as a commercial player professionally across Canada. And since there have been so many discussions here about Doc Reinhardt, he has been a student of Doc's for 10 years and is here to share some insights about the Reinhardt methodology. So welcome, Glenn Libman.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you very much. Nice to be here, guys.
Thanks for being here. Hey, so I'm going to throw out the first question, Glenn. We'd love to know about how you first met Doc and discovered his system.
I started playing trumpet at an early age. I played in my dad's band. I played in an orchestra for CBC, and everything was going great for about 15 years. And I played as a commercial trumpet player. And in 1969, I went to Berklee School of Music in Boston. And as you can imagine, the guys I encountered were tremendous players. They were from all around the world. In fact, a quick story is one of the guys that I met was from Rio de Janeiro, and he didn't speak too much English, and I had to help him fill out all the forms. And you may know his name. His name was Claudio Roditi.
Oh, wow.
And I met Claudio, and I went to an ensemble with him, and I started playing my little jazz solo, and then he did his jazz solo. And I'll tell you, I wanted to put my trumpet in the case and fly home to Winnipeg. This guy was just unbelievable. I went to see him we were in the same, you have to stay in the dorm. So I went to his dorm room and I said, how did you learn how to play all like this? I mean, you're just unbelievable. And he says, Glenn, I try to emulate all the greats. He says, ask me to and I said, okay, do Louis Armstrong. He did Louis Armstrong. Do this, do that, do this, do that. He did everything. Anyways, this is the era of the screech trumpet player. A lot of the lead players that I encountered at Berklee, they all had double G's, and a lot of them had a strong double C. And actually, they were trying to get up to the G above, believe it or not. So what happened to me is, because I had being a commercial player, I had a G, but not as a lead player like you, Paul. So I, of course, got into the practice room and I started playing harder and harder and harder just to compete with the guys. And basically what happened to me is I played so hard that I got a cyst on the top of my lip. So I went home to Winnipeg. I saw my family doctor, and he took out an electric needle and he burned out that cyst. The problem is, it left scar tissue, and I had a low placement. So now I had to take off a number of months. And then when I tried to play, literally, because I had no formal training, my dad taught me how to play, I couldn't play a note. And I didn't know what to do. What could I do? So I went back to Berklee. I changed my, instead of being a trumpet major, I switched over to arranging and composition, which was not my skill. I just didn't know what to do because I really couldn't play, and I wanted to continue studying. Anyway, so I knew a lot of guys, and there were a lot of guys in Berklee that were going to visit a guy in Philadelphia, and his name was Doc Reinhardt. So I thought, so I had problems, and I talked to some of the guys, and they said, look, man, if you're having trouble, you got to go see Doc in Philadelphia. I said, Doc, Philadelphia, Jesus, Murphy, what? Anyway, so I talked to my dad, and he says, look, Glenn, he said, if you got to go to Philadelphia, you got to go to Philadelphia. So I wrote Doc a long letter with tears in my eyes, and he wrote back to me, and he said, Glenn, come to Philadelphia. I will do my best to help you regain your chops. So I phoned him up. I made an appointment, and I'll tell you, man, it was a nightmare. I had to take a bus, a Grey Goose bus or a Greyhound bus from Boston, and it left at midnight. I got to New York at 4 o'clock in the morning. Then I got to Philly early morning. I take a lesson from 9 to 10. Then I get back on the bus and go back to Boston.
Wow.
So that's how I met Doc Reinhardt. And basically, the orientation, it was a 2-hour orientation, and it was very interesting. I mean, basically, he was talking to me for about a half an hour, and I was thinking, what is this teacher doing? Is this a scam, or what's going on, you know? And after about a half an hour, Doc says, you're probably wondering why I'm talking to you for a half an hour. And I said, yeah, I was kind of wondering that, you know. And Doc said, he says, I'm studying your embouchure, Glenn. He says, I'm looking, when you talk, I'm seeing how your jaw moves. I'm seeing how your lips move. He says, I'm actually in the process of analyzing you. And then he did some tests and basically try to establish what my pivot was. After he established what my pivot was, then we looked at what my tongue was doing. I was tonguing between my lips, and he said, this is not the way to tongue. You have to do it another way. And then he showed me, or told me what way I had to correct, and gave me an assignment, and that was it. I went home, took the bus home, and just started working on Doc's stuff.
So Glenn, give us a brief outline of how Doc discovered the pivot.
That's a great question, Bobby. First of all, I'd like to tell you just a little bit of information or background on Doc Reinhardt, Donald S. He loved the trombone. He was a very serious man, very serious boy. And when he took on something, he wanted to do it to the best of his abilities. So he started to play the trombone. He practiced many hours a day. And he went to one teacher, and he just hit a level. You know, we all hit levels, and all of a sudden you can't get any better. So then he got frustrated, and then he thought, well, I'll go to another teacher. So he went to another teacher. And one teacher says, well, you got to play long tones. And after about 6 months, Doc was getting nowhere. He's practicing a lot. He's playing his long tones. And then he goes back to the teacher after 6 months. He says, so what's I'm practicing the long tones. I'm not getting anywhere. And then the guy says, well, give it time. And Doc says, well, I've been doing it for 6 months. How much time should I give it? And then he went to another teacher. Same scenario. Try this. And he went to many, many teachers. I'll say 10 teachers. I don't know how many.
Wow. And
nothing worked. Anyways, one day, Doc dinged his trombone slide. And he had it repaired. And then the trombone came back. He took it out of the case just to see if it was working and everything. And all of a sudden, when he played a note, he squeaked out a high F on the trombone. Now, Doc had been playing for years, studying with 10 teachers. He was never able to play higher than a B flat. So how did he squeak out this F? Of course, being Doc Reinhardt, being the analytical guy that he was, oh, I noticed something. He took a look in the mirror, and the horn angle had come down considerably. And when it came down, it made the lips, his lower lips, roll in. And that's how he played the high F. And then Doc thought, well, why did the horn angle come down? What made that happen? When they repaired the trombone, they didn't put the counterweight back on.
Ah.
So the bell was top heavy. And what happened is, when it was top heavy, the horn angle came down. And all of a sudden, Doc, who had been practicing long tones and this and that, all of a sudden he could squeak out a high F. Well, you could think, he was in ecstasy, man. It was like, wow, what's going on? And then that's how the pivot system got started. Everybody he played with, whether in high school or when he was playing professionally. Everybody he played with, if he would play a gig with Paul in the pit, he would be looking at Paul's chops and analyzing Paul and saying, gee, why does Arnie Tchaikovsky have that high placement or the low placement and the high angle? How come Bud Herseth has a low angle of his horn? And then he would look at all of these things and he would factor all of the information. And that was basically the beginning of the pivot system. And I lost my thought here for a sec. So Doc, basically really analyzed all of these. He analyzed a lot of people.
So, well, that brings me to my next question then. Can you explain, give an outline of what the pivot system is?
Yes, of course. What I wanted to do, just because there's been a lot of, you see a lot of things on the internet now and even on the site that I love. And, I'm thrilled with the job you and Bobby are doing with the tips for trumpet players over 50 and the trumpet diagnostics. It's wonderful. Thank you very much on behalf of the trumpet community. What I want to do, just to make sure that we're totally accurate, is I'm going to read a page from Doc's book, and it basically says, what is the pivot? So I'm just going to read from Doc's book here. Each and every brass instrumentalist who possesses the required range, power, flexibility, endurance utilizes the pivot as a means of coordinating his playing factors to his particular physical type, whether the manipulation is unconscious or subconscious. In other words, every brass performer pivots whether he realizes it or not. There's a lot of guys that say, oh, I don't think I pivot. Well, this fact I have proven for more than 40 years of research as an analyst and consultant for many thousands of brass players around the world. The primary purpose of the pivot is to form a natural lip pucker. Basically speaking, the pivot pulls or pushes the performer's lips into the path of the air column so that the air column will cause the lips to vibrate over the entire range of the instrument. In other words, a pivot is the physical means by which a performer may constantly maintain the all essential lineup of his lips with his teeth so that the required lip vibrations for the production of the sound are not hampered or impeded in any particular part of the range. I just thank you for letting me read that from Doc's book. I wanted to make sure we got it right. And, because this is a video, I know everybody will be able to say, I didn't get what he was saying, but they'll be able to go back and forth and figure it out. Thanks for letting me do that.
Sure.
Very cool. Well, that's interesting. Can I, before we go on to the question I was thinking about you, I have one other question that I think is really important, and I think this is something that really needs to be clarified, because there's all these stories about Doc that exist, that I've heard. And I just want to, I got my horn here, so I want to try to clarify what Doc was talking about necessarily wasn't necessarily the angle, right, as you were playing, because that you play at. I mean, that can be part of it, but didn't he later change the term pivot to tracking? Is that correct?
No. No, that's incorrect.
Okay, so then
I think what you're thinking about, Bobby, is and I think Chris LaBarbera does a little thing on YouTube where he demonstrates an exercise that Doc did. It's called the track routine.
Okay.
That's what you're thinking about.
Okay, so when we're talking about the pivot, then is that is actually the angle at which your horn is being played? Is that correct?
I think the biggest mistake that Doc made, forgive me, Doc, for saying this, is naming the system the pivot system. And everybody thinks like you said, the pivot is moving the horn up and down and, sideways, and some guys say flag waving. What he should have done is just written the encyclopedia as this is a brass encyclopedia for, trumpet, trombone, French horn, tuba, and it just and for brass cupped instruments. The pivot is the terminology. I feel could have been different, but really, what the pivot is, it's the distribution of weight and the shifting of weight. And when you shift the weight, usually diagonally, because you have malocclusion when you bite down. No, there's only one in a gazillion that has perfect teeth. So if you're one of the regular guys that doesn't have perfect teeth, like me, you, and probably Paul and a whole bunch of other guys, your pivot's going to be diagonal. But basically what you're doing is you're shifting the weight. So when you ascend, you will shift the weight. And when you shift the weight, you're actually pulling your lips slightly to one side or slightly to the other side. And what you're doing is you're allowing, when you pull the lips, you're allowing the air column to shift. And it puts your jaw for ascending in a certain classification. For ascending, it puts your jaw in a certain position. When you descend, you do basically the opposite. So you then we'll have to talk about the pivot classifications.
Okay, well then the next question then, that pretty much clarifies it. And just for everybody else, when you have a malocclusion, and let me make sure I understand this correctly, if your jaw lines, it's like when your jaw lines up not perfectly centered, right? A malocclusion is when you're kind of sideways. Okay. So then, the big question is, that I think a lot of people, have, and I've certainly had over the years, is how to determine, how do you determine whether you're an upstream player or a downstream player?
That's a great question, Bobby. And I like it very much. The most important factor in determining if you're an upstream or a downstream player, the number one factor is when you place the mouthpiece. Do you have more upper lip? Is your mouthpiece higher on your top lip, or is it lower? If you have so, a lot of times, and Paul made mention of this one time about 50-50. It's hard to say 50-50 because our lips are not straight. They're not horizontal, vertical, that type of thing. You know what I'm saying? They're curved, right? So basically, if you're, let's say your lip placement is 60-40, top lip 60, bottom lip 40, you will be a downstream player. If you're 70-30, you're a downstream player. If you're 85-15, you're a downstream player. And all of those percentages that I gave you, Doc has categories for each of those types with the different percentages. If you are a upstream player, you have a low placement, usually 25% upper lip, 75% lower lip. So the first and foremost thing when I analyze a player, I look at where his placement is. So if a guy's got a high placement, I quite quickly check the box and say, okay, I think we're going to deal with a downstream player. If he's got a lower placement, the box that I check is upstream player.
So Glenn, can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
With using the example, because Harry James, was so high placement, like pretty much resting on the red of his lower lip. But he looked like his horn was angling up. Now, just for my own clarification, because he's such high placement, Does that mean he's a downstream player, even though
Yes.
the angle of his
Yes.
horn
No,
was up?
that's what I'm saying, Paul.
Okay, okay.
Number one, and I'll tell you what, we'll go through the classifications on. I will explain that
Oh,
exactly
okay,
to you.
excellent.
And
I'm jumping the gun
but
then. Sorry.
no, you're not jumping. That's a great question, and we have to have an interaction here. But again, number one thing, if you got a high placement, 9 times out of 10, 99 out of 100 guys, if they got a high placement, they're downstream players. However, I have to make it totally clear, and Doc was adamant about this. There are exceptions to every rule.
Ah.
You know, there just is. And basically it just could be, how your teeth are formed, just maybe something very unique to Paul Barron or Bobby Medina or Glenn Libman. And so, but the number one thing is the placement. If the placement's high, if you feel that he has a high placement, I don't care if it's up to his nose, doesn't matter. It's a high placement.
Yeah.
In all instances, he's a downstream player. So the number one thing to determine if you're an upstream player or a downstream player is your placement. High placement, downstream player. Low placement, upstream player. The second determination is your horn angle. In most cases, if you're a downstream player, your horn angle will be horizontal or pointing downward. But there is an exception. And actually, Harry James is that exception. So Harry James, and actually, I'll go to another player that's more current, and maybe some of the guys will be more familiar with. But Harry James, of course, hey, what can I say? I love him. And what a monster player. Of course, he grew up in the circuses, and this guy had chops to burn. I mean, he was playing F's and G's in the 30s or the 40s? I don't know. Anyways, this type of player is classified as a 3. All downstream players are classified as 3s. And in all cases, their horn angles are down, with the exception of a guy with a very high placement. And I'm talking 75 or 85, almost up to his nose. And a guy that you can really see that is Chris Bodie.
Uh-huh.
If you watch Chris play, and he's a marvelous player, and when you watch him play, when he ascends the horn, he lifts up. When he descends the horn, he pulls down. So that's.
And you're talking about his lips kind of raising up or going down, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just, Bobby, again, it's not flag waving. It's just when you raise your horn, you're just slightly guiding your lips in that diagonal position to open up the airwave. Okay? So that is the exception, Paul. So basically, usually when you see a guy with a high placement, not a high placement, but a high horn angle, everybody assumes it's an upstream player. I mean, the ultimate guy to look at as far as upstream players, one guy would be, the most famous Canadian lead player would be Arnie Tchaikovsky. The other guy that's a no-brainer as far as an upstream player with a high placement is our friend and exo-clinician Roger Ingram. Those are the typical upstream players. So, Bobby, you were wondering about the classifications, and I know this is a thing you want to get across to the guys. There are 2 pivot classifications. Pivot classification number 1 is a unique one. And what you do is when you ascend, you push up, or you raise your horn angle a little higher. When you descend, you pull down. This classification is unique. And that's the one I'm talking about for Chris Bodie and Harry James. Paul, I wanted to say that one of the things I try to be careful about is that when you analyze, especially famous players, I think you've got to be very, very careful. Like even if I wanted to work with Bobby or you in Zoom, it would be, I could maybe do it, and I think I could do it, but it's always good to do it in person. So I think a lot of guys look at people on the YouTube and they'll talk about famous players and they'll categorize these famous players. And looks can be deceiving, you know, like a guy could have a really fleshy bottom lip, but when he's playing, he curls it in and you don't see that. And yet that'll affect maybe how he tongues. Pivot classification 2 is the most common classification, Bobby. So what you do is when you ascend, you pull down. So if your horn angle is, let's say, horizontal, the bell will just go down slightly. And when it goes down slightly, it shifts your weight. And again, think diagonally, not up and down, diagonally. And it's really the opposite when you descend. When you descend, you will pull slightly up. So the bell of your horn will go slightly up.
So to figure out what your diagonal is, and you have to kind of mess around with it, I would assume, to kind of experiment with to find
no,
it.
It's actually an easy process if you have somebody that understands what the process is. And I think Paul made reference to this in one of the videos that I was watching about the 4 legs. And when you look at your chops, Doc would say there's 4 legs, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom. And his analogy would be, if you have 4 legs of a square table and I take away one of your legs of the table, what happens? The table falls down. So the thing is, if you have 4 legs and we determine, like for instance, for me, what's crucial for me when I set my chops is my left lower leg. And what happens is when I get fatigued or I get tired, the weight shifts away from that left lower leg, and then my chops go, my sound goes, my range goes, and everything. So the thing is, the first thing to do is, and again, I'd be glad to do it for you, Bobby and Paul. Just you do an analysis, and basically you just do a simple test, and it's basically a middle C to a G. But now we're getting into some real specific stuff, so let's move on.
So Glenn, can you explain to us, now that we know the classification of pivot, can you also now explain the different classifications, maybe I'm using the wrong word, but of the types of players? I understand there's A, B, C, D, is that correct?
Well, it's just a matter of how you look at it. So there's four types of players. We don't say classification because there's the pivot classification, right, 1 and 2, and then there's 4 types of players. And this is based on Doc's analysis of the teeth, the gums, and the pivot classifications applied to the different players. So of the 4 types, type number 1 and type number 2 are very, very limited. So just to give you just a real quick scenario about type 1 is a guy with even teeth, no overbite, no underbite. This guy is 1 in a zillion, and he has got perfect teeth. So this guy, he can play with a high placement, he can play with a low placement, he can do anything he wants. And you'll probably, at 6 years old, he'll probably hit a double D, because I mean, his face is just perfect. So, I mean, obviously, there's only one player, I believe, that I met in Philadelphia taking a lesson with Doc, His name was Lynn Biviano. And as legend has it, Lynn, when he played lead for Buddy Rich's band, he was able to play a couple of sets. And when he got tired, he actually was able to move his mouthpiece to the side and still play lead.
Wow.
That's a story. Now, there's maybe somebody out there that confirm. And of course, Lynn became, the lead screech player for Count Basie. So I guess that's what he wanted. His best friend was Bill Chase, and he wanted to emulate Bill. So that's a very unique guy. And like I said, if you ever meet one, I'd be surprised. A type 2 is if you know the Bobby and Paul, I don't know if you know the phrase lantern jaw. No. Lantern jaw is, a guy walks into the room and before you see his face, you see his jaw. So he's got a real protruding big jaw.
Like Jay Leno.
Exactly. Bobby, I got to write that down.
Or anyway. Chuck Connors, remember the Rifleman.
Oh, yeah. You're right.
Well, I think I'm too young to remember that, Paul. Anyways, yeah, Jay Leno for sure. And you don't see that. That's a very unique type. And the only guy that I've seen that has that kind of setup, and I don't know, I'm not really sure of his name. Paul, you would know him. He plays in the Fat Band with Wayne, and I think his name is Dave McGurn. He plays jazz. Anyways, he's the fourth trumpet player, and he's the jazz player, and he's a wonderful player. And if you see him, you'll see that jaw. But again, very, very unique. Now let's get into the bread and the butter, the type 3 and the type 4. Type 3s are downstream players. Type 4s are upstream players. Now I'm going to talk about the downstream players because within the type 3, there's 3 categories. The first category is a straight type 3. Most of those guys are trombone players. They still have an upper lip placement, but it is as low as possible, but still maintaining a downstream position. The most common type 3 is called a 3B. And a 3B is basically a 60-40 scenario. And
being so 60 on the top, correct?
60 on the top, yeah.
Okay.
These again, remember, when you think downstream, the first determination is a high placement.
Right.
Whether it's 60, 70, 80, or whatever.
Sure.
But great, thanks for pointing that out. The pivot classification for a 3B is pivot classification 2. Again, 1 is unique. And again, the pivot classification for the 3B is he slightly lowers and pulls down to ascend and slightly raises his horn and pulls up to ascend. These guys are very, very common. Now, there's another classification. We were talking about it, Paul, and you mentioned it, Harry James, and I mentioned Chris Bodie. The classification is a 3A, very unique. You don't see it very often. There's very few guys that are 3As. Sometimes you look at a guy and he's a 3B, like a 60-40, and you may kind of think, well, no, I think he's maybe 70-30. So again, this is an analysis that has to be done. And I don't like looking at YouTube videos of guys and determining what classification they are, because I think looks are deceiving. So the 3A is as high a placement as you can imagine. It could be 75-25. And that's maybe like with Chris Bodie, when you watch him play, his mouthpiece is very close to his nose. I mean, it's very high. And the other thing that distinguishes Chris as a 3A and what distinguishes a 3A is that his horn angle is not low and it's not down and it's not horizontal. It's actually very high. But he is still a downstream player. But again, a unique player. Now his pivot classification is a 1. When he lifts his horn, he ascends. When he brings the horn down, he descends. And if you see Chris taking a solo and then he takes it off of his chops and then he's got some beautiful singer or some other guy playing great or Sting there, you will see a crease on this guy's chops like it's unbelievable. So check that guy out. So that's basically the 3s. Now I go to the 4s, which are upstreams. There are 2 upstream types of players. The first one is a traditional type 4 upstream player, and the best example I always like to say is Arnie Tchaikovsky, who is well known in North America, from Toronto, played with the Boss Brass, beautiful guy, miss him very much. And when Arnie set up, the head is down and the horn is quite high, but his pivot is when he ascends, he pulls down. When he descends, he goes up. The next classification for an upstream player is a 4A. And the difference being they both have low placements to make them upstream players. They both have similar pivots or classifications, pull down to ascend, push up to descend. The difference being the 4A doesn't have the jaw to go far enough out, so their position is horizontal or lower. And the interesting thing is, and you'll like this, Paul, because I think you were talking about this one time. If you look at a 4A and you look at a 3B, they both have their horns down horizontal or lower. They both pivot similarly, pulling down to ascend, pushing up to descend. What's the difference? It's the difference that qualifies if you're an upstream or a downstream player. And if you're the difference is the placement. Okay. So if you got the high placement and your horn angle is down, you're a downstream player. Me, I'm an upstream player, and my horn is down, well, actually horizontal or a little bit down. What's the difference? Lower placement. And because I got injured with the electric needle when I had a cyst on my lip, I have scar tissue where my actual placement was for 15 years. And then I had to lower that placement. And when I lowered that placement, believe it or not, I play almost on the red. And it affects your endurance, it affects your range. So that's one of the reasons I had to switch and join Yamaha Canada as a product specialist and get into the sales and marketing of band instruments. So I don't know if you guys have any questions. Is that pretty clear or
that is? I have one other question. I have one other question, and that is that I've been told that for certain types or classifications of players, they should be practicing certain things, and that's good. And then there's others that shouldn't be practicing a certain thing. Like, for instance, nope.
No, excellent. That's
okay.
An excellent question. I was just going to say, I want to just really throw this out to you guys and to the people listening. Forget about the classifications. The classifications are just pulling up or down. It's just basically pulling up or down. But let's talk upstream and downstream. It's an excellent point, and it's a critical point. I'll put it to you this way: if you're a kid playing in a high school band, and you're a downstream player, you are able to, in the beginning of your studying the trumpet, because you have a high placement, you were able to produce a very good sound. An upstream player with a lower placement he has trouble playing a good sound. The reason being is that with the lower placement, the upstream player has a great amount of flexibility. So when you have a lot of flexibility and a lot of compression, it thins out your sound. So it makes sense that a downstream player who has a good sound, he doesn't really have to work on the sound. And I know symphony players. I used to be friends with the guy who played in the Winnipeg Symphony and actually now plays in the Detroit Symphony. And he used to go fishing and hunting and camping for three weeks, and he wouldn't touch his horn. And I say, Jesus, what happens when you get back? It must be really hard. He says, nah, it's not a big deal. And he was a downstream player, so he puts that thing on his chops, and he can play. So the difference, you have to practice differently. So let's take a downstream player. And I was watching you play on some things, Paul. You're a guy that I think I'd have to shave your mustache to figure out what we do with you. because I can't really tell whether you're an upstream or downstream. I'd have to really take a look. But basically how a downstream player would practice, they can practice for long periods of time. So it's not unheard of a downstream player, picking up the horn, maybe doing some long tones and maybe doing some flexibilities, doing some finger exercises, finger Clark studies, doing some tonguing in the Brandt book or whatever, doing some Charlier, and for him playing like an hour. But what happens after an hour is it's not particularly that he gets fatigued. His top lip swells, because with the upper placement, once you start to experience fatigue after 45 minutes or an hour, your weight shifts from your bottom lip, which is your anchor. It shifts to your top lip. Your top lip swells, and then you got to take a serious rest. And a serious rest is 1.5 hours or longer. So basically, if you're a downstream player, let's say you have a rehearsal in the afternoon, and then you got a 3 or 4 hour break, and you got to do the show at night, you're fine. You're okay. What an upstream player has to do, he starts the day with his jaw in a fairly receded position, meaning that his sound is not very good. He's all flexibility. He's tight in his cheeks. So basically, what he has to do is concentrate on sound. He has to do a lot more long tones, a lot more flexibilities, slow flexibilities. And he can play, he has to play in short spurts. So he can warm up. He can play like a long tone exercise, let's say for 10 minutes. And then after 10 minutes, he's got to take a 10-minute break. And then he can play for 15 minutes, and then he'll take a 15-minute break. I think one of the guys that responded to something that you and Bobby do on the Trumpeters 50 plus was my friend and my I have a lot of respect for Roger Ingram. And Roger, if you remember, Roger is the epitome of an upstream player, great lead trumpet player, great guy. And he told you, I practice for 30 minutes, I rest for 30 minutes. I practice for 30 minutes, I rest for 30 minutes. He does that for the whole day. This is his day. He'll start at 9 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock in the morning, and he'll finish at midnight. But he can only do those short spurts. And why? Because the lower placement can only hold for a certain amount of time, and then it slips out of the groove and you can't play. So and when you're tired, when an upstream player is tired, he gets that double buzz. You get that lip vibration, and it's basically it's happening all over the place. It's like it's just falling apart, and you get like a double buzz. I'm trying to think of the terminology and I can't remember, but that's how an upstream player practices. So basically if you got an upstream player and he's limited in his time and he wants to play for an hour, he's not going to progress too much. But Roger, and the other thing is, even Roger made this point, and it's an excellent point, that even if he has a gig or a recording session, he will still do 2 or 3 sessions. He'll play an hour, but he'll do like 30 minutes, rest 30 minutes, play 30 minutes. Because if he goes to that studio gig or he's playing with Harry Connick Jr. and he doesn't warm up and put his jaw into playing position, he's going to have a heck of a time playing. He has to do that warm up. Where a downstream player, he can probably go right to the gig. The other thing is, and this is a critical point, there are some people that will not agree with what I'm going to tell you, but basically buzzing was a way to teach you how to play. If you're an upstream player, you have so much flexibility and so much compression built into your face. Buzzing is just a detriment, because what buzzing does is it tightens up. It tightens up your corners. It firms your aperture. It firms everything up, and not your aperture. I'm sorry, but it firms your
embouchure.
Your embouchure. That's the word I was looking. Thank you, Bobby. And so a downstream player can really go to town on buzzing. So it's very great for a downstream player. So you can see that when you look at Doc's book, and if you study with Doc, if you were a downstream player, he would design an assignment for you that would be for a downstream player. Like you wouldn't have to do a lot of sound stuff, because you inherently, physically, your makeup dictates that you have a good sound. Now, what a downstream player doesn't have is he usually doesn't have compression. So Doc would do a lot of buzzing drills with that particular player. And that player has a tendency, I don't know if you've ever experienced it, because I haven't analyzed you guys, but a downstream player, if he plays a gig at night and he's really taxed, let's say a 3-4 hours gig, and then he wakes up the next day and everything's tight, that's when Doc would, a lot of guys say, oh, just play softly and take it easy and don't strain and everything. The opposite can be true. What can be true is if you're a downstream player and you're tight in your cheeks, what you have to do is cheek puffs. And if you look in the mirror and you just go like this, the first thing you see, everybody says, oh, Dizzy Gillespie, it's a cheek puff. But what you should be looking at, look at my corners. As soon as I do a cheek puff, my corners come forward. And there's an exercise that Doc does, and it's, you put out your cheeks, and once you puff out your cheeks, you gotta really increase the pressure. But that's a lesson for someone. I'm getting carried away here.
This is all really interesting, because as you're speaking of what would be detrimental or advantageous to certain players, I'm realizing for me, and it's taken many years of being on the road and beating the hell out of myself and all that, to realize that I really need to spend time in the morning. And as you said, a downstream player would need that hour and a half, 2-3 hours, whatever, off. If I get my warm up and I go into a practice routine and I do even an hour or an hour and a half, and I can go that long.
Yeah, of course.
I really need that time in between. So if I've got a 2:00 matinee, I'll start at 9:30 in the morning, and I'll maybe do an hour and a half, but I have that downtime in between. When I get to the show, it's fine. And then if I have the second show, it's also fine. But boy, if I don't do that warm up and have that amount of break time in between, I'm not set up for the day. And I discovered that showing up to a gig, yes, I can get away with just warming up right before the gig. And I can do that for 2 or 3 days in a row, but it'll catch up on me. So then I have to be more diligent to do the morning. So I suspect I'm falling under one, sort of.
It leads me to believe, and this is like I said, we should get together one time and just talk. But this leads me to believe that I know your horn angle is horizontal and maybe a little bit down. And again, when I look at your chops, I can't really see because I don't like to do it on the screen.
Right.
But it leads me to believe, if you're saying that, it leads me to believe that you're probably a 3B. You're probably a downstream. You probably pull down to a stand, push up to descend.
Yes.
And what happens is, why you need that long rest, it's basically when you do your hour, you reach a point where you start to get fatigued. Everybody has that point. And then you go from your anchor spot on your bottom lip, and your pressure shifts to your upper lip. Your upper lip swells, and you're done like dinner. And what has to happen is you need a longer rest, or I don't know, maybe what's that? The guy from Maynard's band that does the lip recovery.
Kenny.
Kenny Robinson's Remedies. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good thing. But the other thing, Paul.
Oh, I like to bathe in that stuff. I love it.
But yeah. But you must be a downstream player, anyways. but the other,
or an idiot.
But the other thing is, like the warm up is important, because the thing is, like, a lot of times when we start the day, our jaw is in our natural receded position. That's why we warm up. And the thing is, you have to do your warm up, and it's really critical. Now, a guy like you that's playing every night, and like you say, the demands for a trumpet player playing the shows that you're playing. I mean, like you say, you can have written double A's, written double C's. You got to do delicate stuff. You got to do piccolo stuff. I mean, that's a heck of a job that you got to do, and you have to take care. But I'll tell you, I was reading some of Doc's stuff, and you'll like this, Paul. One of the things that Doc says for every player before he starts playing in the morning, drink 2 big glasses of water. And I know you're a dehydration guy.
You know, it really does help. Yep.
It's really, really, really critical. So the thing is, if you're a downstream player, then you should check out cheek puffing. And I just want to make this is really interesting, because I asked Doc about Dizzy Gillespie. And I said, Jesus, Murphy, I mean, Dizzy with his cheek puff, everybody, it's like a bullfrog. What's going on there? And Doc says, everybody looks at the cheek puff. Well, what they don't look at is once he puts the mouthpiece and he starts playing, that thing is solid as a rock. It's solid as a rock. And usually when guys are cheek puffing, the physical reason for that is they have a smaller mouth cavity. And most guys, when they play in their upper register, I'd love to be watching you play in your upper register. Most of the guys that you see playing in the upper register have some form of puffing. Chase had a neck puff. There's a lot of guys that have an upper lip puff. Maynard had a little bit of a puff down here. So it differs for different guys. But yeah, you have to know yourself. And the thing is, if you're a downstream player and you start the day with a decent sound, why would you work on sound? Not that you shouldn't work on sound. You should work on vibrato. You should work on, your dynamics and everything. But I think it'd be interesting. I'd love to work to look at your chops. It would be. I love doing that.
We'll both have to shave our mustaches.
I'm only shaving half.
Yeah.
So, hey.
I'd probably fall over because the counterweight is gone then.
So, hey, Glenn, I know we're just about out of time, but if you would, I have one final thing I'd like to ask you to maybe shed some light on here, because this has just been really enlightening. Can you just talk a little bit about the different tongue types that players have? Because I know this was a part of his teaching as well, right?
Okay. First of all, I want to make one comment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
If you guys will allow me to do this. I heard a comment. I don't know if it was a post or a comment. And somebody said that Doc asked most of his players and his students to set up by tonguing. That's incorrect. Everything that Doc does, everything that he writes is slurred. Okay? And Bobby, just for your information, that's how the track routine came about. The track routine is a flexibility. I'm sorry, my cell phone's going crazy. The track routine is a flexibility exercise. So picture middle C, E, G. Do 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 do. All of Doc's he would ask everybody to slur that. However, and I'm the guy that meets that category, if he found that you had a lot of angular motion in your chops when you slur, sometimes you watch a guy play and you see him really moving around, Bobby. Then you tongue and there's no movement. So you would say, okay, when you're tonguing, your jaw is perfectly aligned, your chops are working correctly. But when you slur, you're moving all over the place. So the purpose of the track routine would be tongue first, correctly, jaw in the right position, and on the same breath, slur. And then you train your jaw to learn how to slur. That's the track routine. I'll roughly go over the tonguing things. And Bobby, I can start with you personally. You said that, yeah, I tried the anchor tonguing, or I tried this, or I tried that. So the traditional way of tonguing is you tongue behind your top teeth. And it's the old syllables. Doc Severinsen would say this, ta for the low register, tu for the middle register, t for the upper register. And if you guys could just repeat after me, ta,
Ta, ta,
tu,
Two,
t.
T.
And when you do that, you're going like this, ta, tu, t. So your tongue angle is going higher and higher and higher. And your tongue controls the airstream. So when you go t, 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 that might be a high C or a high E. But if you go tu, 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 that's going to be a middle C or a middle E. So that's the number one type of tonguing. And that's traditional. That's for a guy with just basic average tongue, whatever. What dictates the tonguing, guys, is the length of the tongue and the width of the tongue. So some guys, like me, and I'm not bragging now, but I have a little bit of a longer tongue. So when I do the traditional ta, tu, ti, it gets pretty sloppy. So if you meet a student that is tonguing traditionally like ta, tu, ti, and they're really sloppy, and you work on their tonguing, and you work on the brand book, and you work on whatever tonguing exercises. I know, Paul, you've written a book, and you have a lot of stuff to say about, how to tongue and tonguing exercises, I should say. They can't tongue traditionally. So, Bobby, this is one of the things that I remember you talking about in another video. Those guys will attack behind their teeth. So they'll go ta, tu, ti, but after they hit that syllable, they'll go ta, and then the tongue will go into the gully. So take your tongue and you'll go behind your bottom teeth and behind the rugae there. I'm lisping now. And you put the tongue right in the gully. And what happens is, so you're articulating behind the teeth, but when you sustain, your tongue goes into the gully. So that's the second way of tonguing. The third way of tonguing, and this is the way I tongue, it's, Doc says type 5 tongue, but the common guys commonly call this the anchor tongue. Uh-huh. And what happens is, if you have a little bit of a longer tongue, and you can determine it when the student is really sloppy tonguing, they just can't deal with, their tongue is too long for what you want them to do. So you start with the tongue in the gully, you start with the tongue in the gully, and you actually leave it in the gully, and you go ta, tu, ti. You can't really see that, can you?
So it's just back from the tip of the tongue, like there, so as opposed to the tip.
Yeah. So what you're basically tonguing, I don't want to say the middle of the tongue, but it's basically
The
you know,
flat of the tongue.
Now that is controlling. That's controlling the air quantity. And you know what? A lot of guys that try that, they fight me tooth and nail because they say, "Oh, I can't do it, Glenn. It's impossible." Da 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 da. But you know what? Think about it. When you have your, can you see this, Bobby? So when you're tonguing behind your teeth, you're going ta ta two two. There's a lot of motion there. When your tongue's in the gully, uh, 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 there's no movement. The only thing is you have to get used to it. You have to get used to it. And Doc would say the only time something is new is the first time. So we talked about pivot classifications today. So tomorrow, Bobby, when you think about pivot classifications, it's not new, my friend, anymore. It's day two.
I think I understand. I think I understand it now a little bit more. That's cool.
Now I'm going to give you the last tongue type, and I'm just giving you the general overview. They say you shouldn't tongue between your teeth, but there are always exceptions to the rules. Please understand that. Doc always said there are always exceptions. Don't put your hand, don't put your head in the sand, And so the fourth one, you will encounter people or players, whether men or women, that have what I call fleshy lips. So kind of fat lips. They'll have like a kind of a fat bottom lip. And those people, because you may not see it, but when you roll it out, you might see that, wow, they got a big lower lip. And those people, because of the size of their fleshy lips, they will tongue between their teeth off of the lower lip. It's very unique, but it's somebody with, really fleshy. Do you know what I mean by fleshy type lips? You're understanding that? Okay.
Absolutely.
And that's basically the four types. But basically, the tongue it's very important. I mean, Doc would say there's three basic things. There's the embouchure, there's tonguing, and there's breathing. So for a player like Paul or a player like you, Bobby, when you're a professional player, your embouchures are working. You know how to tongue. You should be, when you take that hour and a half rest, Paul, that's when you should be maybe doing some yoga breathing or whatever, And by the way, Doc confirms, even though he wrote the book in the 40s and did all of his exercises on the 40s, he's on the same page as our friend Bobby Shu. You do not protrude your abdomen, and and that, the guys in the 40s, and they were getting a lot of hernias and problems. He basically says take a deep breath or take a breath, and then you pull up, and that's how you breathe. So he was on the same page, or maybe Bobby read Doc's book. I don't know, but they certainly are on the same page. And I think Bobby is he's one of the great educators, obviously.
He sure is.
Yeah, I think
his
he passed.
Latest, I'm sorry, Bobby. His latest video where he describes, I always knew it as the 3 steps to his breath, and
right.
I think what has he got 5 now, Bobby? That on that video.
Yeah, there's a lot of clarification on it, but he had told me that he had a double hernia before, had to get it fixed, and kind of figured it out. And I think it was Bud Brisbois that turned him on to the science of breath, that yoga breath, and that's kind of where he learned it, or Maynard or somebody.
Maynard gave him the book. Yeah.
I think Maynard gave him the book,
yeah.
but the interesting
Bud did
thing
it
is,
as well.
The interesting thing is that two of the great players of the galaxy are Doc Severinsen and Maynard Ferguson, and I'll tell you, the best. There's a 3-part clinic that Doc Severinsen does. It's a really older, but the interesting thing is he does it and he just says, this works for me. And like he does this thing where he's doing the stamp things. It's a 3-octave thing, and he does it and he says, geez, I I don't know why it works, but I do it and I like to do it and it works for me. And Jimmy Stamp didn't put any written instructions, but it just works, you know? And so he doesn't mention names and types and all that kind of stuff. And you've got to respect that because, you know, a guy like Doc Severinsen, if he said, you know, you should do this, everybody would try to do that, you know? So I have a great respect for those players, and I've really enjoyed our time here, guys. So
Yeah, thank you
I
so
want to really
much.
thank you. I want to really thank you, and again, you and Paul, you're doing a great job, and hopefully we're all learning. You know, we're all learning every time I talk about my experiences, or even with Doc Reinhardt. I mean, you guys made me go into the book and read back my notes and everything. So we're always learning. And as long as we keep learning, we're in good shape.
Yeah, I
Right,
think Doc
exactly.
Severinsen is a great example of that. He's always learning. And, you know, we had Bobby Shue on a while back, and he
Yeah,
said,
I
yeah,
saw.
and he talked about Doc coming to him for a lesson. And he, you know, he's
Yes.
saying, what can I tell Doc Severinsen? But Doc felt like there was something there, and I'm quite sure there was. So we're always learning, or we should always be learning.
Yeah.
And you know what? I've never, you know, when you talk to, you know, serious trumpet players, I mean, guys that really want to learn and know, and, you know, it's just like me. I can help you and maybe tell you some stuff about the pivot system and Doc Reinhardt. But then, you know, like I don't, Alex in Toronto has helped me with some stuff with Jimmy Stamp, and you know, if I wanted to learn about Jimmy Stamp, I guess, you know, I'd want to learn from a student like Bobby. Bobby studied with Jimmy Stamp, so
Yep.
you know, maybe we can get together, Bobby, and you can help me with Jimmy Stamp stuff, and I can help you with questions about
Sure,
Doc
I'd love
Reinhardt.
to. I mean, this is one of the beauties I think about the synergy Paul and I have together because we both come from different playing backgrounds and we've both gone through a lot of issues ourselves.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we've learned bits and pieces from all these different systems and through our own experiences of trying to get through gigs and by our own experimentation. So I'm not really tied to any sort of a method. It's just more just sort of like Doc said, I've found the things that worked for me. And then, you know, and then hopefully I can pass some of those things on, and occasionally things that didn't work for me at one point, I have one of these, now I
yeah,
see, now it's working 2 years
yeah,
later or 5 years later or
yeah.
something, you know? So we have those little, as Bobby Shue calls them, oh shit moments, you
Yeah.
know? And, anyways, Glenn, it's been so great having you, man. We really
Thank you,
appreciate you
guys.
taking the time to chat with us and hang out here. And, you know,
I've enjoyed it.
we will get together. We'll get together, you and I, and probably Paul and
Anytime,
I, and we'll
anytime you want to get together, I'm there for you.
That
And
sounds great.
appreciate it.
thank you very much for having me, and it was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Glenn.
Take care, guys. Bye bye.